Sure.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. Now we're all good. Thank you, Jenna. I can hear you fine.
Okay. Sounds great. Thanks so much, Amanda. I really appreciate it. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Jenna, as Amanda mentioned, and I am a program development coordinator at the Invasive Species Center. I work actually mostly in our policy division. That's a bit more related to my background, but I do love, talking about invasive species. And so I'm really excited to be here. I wear a number of different hats too. I also am fortunate enough to be part of the Muskoka Conservancy's board. And so that's another kind of fun little avenue. And I really appreciate all the work that the Conservancy does, including Amanda and Cameron's really hard work. So it's just my pleasure to be here today. So thanks again. So we'll dive in. I will do a land acknowledgement for the Invasive Species Center as well to kind of get us started. I'd like to acknowledge that the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people on the lands now known as Canada, and strives to show and respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. We greatly appreciate the significance of the lands, waters, and all living things, and offer our gratitude to the Indigenous people for their care and teachings about our earth. Our relationships with Indigenous communities are important, and we will continue to listen and learn on how we can be in a good relationship with Indigenous peoples, the lands, the waters, and all living things, and act accordingly. So the Invasive Species Center respectfully acknowledges that our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robinson Huron Treaty area. So today I'm actually speaking to you from the city of Sudbury, which is the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabe, and I also grew up in Muskoka. So that's a little bit of where I am, and a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Invasive Species Center. We actually also recently had an Indigenous artist create a really beautiful piece of art that's now in our lobby. So if you have a moment to check it out on our website, it's worth looking at, and it's really representative of a lot of the work we do and the work that we would like to continue to do with Indigenous people. So just a little bit about the Invasive Species Center as well for some context. It's a non-for-profit organization that connects stakeholders to knowledge and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. So you'll notice that these are kind of the three pillars of impacts that we like to discuss. The environment, economy, and society kind of all go hand in hand, and invasive species kind of have a touch on all of them. So we like to kind of talk about them all together. So if you do have a moment and you want to take a look, we've got a newsletter website similar to the Conservancy, same kind of work, but all relative to invasive species. So we do all the bad ones. Yeah. So just for some context, I like to take a big step back and kind of recognize where invasive species sit kind of in the landscape of the environment. And so invasive species are actually the second greatest threat to biodiversity loss globally, next to only habitat destruction. And so this is it's a really significant issue that I'm a little bit biased, but goes underappreciated. It's something that's really, you may not notice until you notice. And then once you start to see invasive species, you see them everywhere, and it becomes a bit overwhelming, but it is a significant threat that is we can do something about it, and so just for context again, a pretty big problem globally. So for a little bit of a definition, a species is considered invasive when it's introduced to an ecosystem outside of its native range. So this kind of and then the second kind of criteria would be that it would have these impacts on the economy, society, and environment. So it does need to have kind of those two factors leading into its definition, because there are species that are introduced that don't have kind of an impact on the environment. So that would be more of an exotic species. But the invasive side of it kind of comes into play when it does have, factors that, force it to kind of outcompete native species for resources and kind of develop into more of an issue. So some characteristics of many invasive species would be that, it's not native to that environment, as I mentioned. It's fast growing and reproduces really quickly. So often because of, its ability to reproduce so quickly, it does, like I say, outcompete a native species. And then there are a lack of natural predators that also allows it to kind of become more of a problem and just continue to reproduce. So again, those kind of go hand in hand. And then there are no defense mechanisms for native host species as well to defend themselves against an invasive species. So usually these kind of four factors allow a species to, spread very rapidly and without any, ability for native ecosystems to be able to adapt or, kind of combat them. And so, they become an invasive and they become a problem. So there are a number of things that invasive species can do to an ecosystem that can damage it. So I'll just go through our wheel quickly here of things that invasive species can do. So they reduce biodiversity by outcompeting desirable native species. You'll notice I say the word outcompete a lot because that is the primary thing that invasive species do, is that they are, aggressive species that are able to just continue to grow in often poor conditions where other species may not have the capacity to grow as quickly or as in the same kind of health that invasive species can grow in. So they kill native plants and trees that provide valuable socioeconomic and ecological benefits. So that kind of points more to the economy side of things, where species can actually outcompete other species that may be more ornamental or used, in terms of landscaping and things like that. So there is a social side of that as well. They reduce critical habitats that species at risk need. So as Amanda mentioned, there are species that, because they outcompete the native ones so quickly, they end up pushing out species at risk or adding an extra layer to already difficult circumstances for species at risk. So namely, I'm thinking of turtles here as well. Amanda, big turtle lover, and it's really hard to, understand that invasive species do have impacts on wetlands and habitats that are already really fragile. So Phragmites is kind of the big example of that, and we can talk about that in a few minutes. But invasive Phragmites are a weed, basically that will just grow in a wetland and basically force out species at risk. So invasive species can also infect, wound, or kill species at risk as well. So in this image, you can see a fish. So a lot of aquatic invaders are also an issue for different species of fish, namely in the Great Lakes, kind of in our area. They can eliminate or greatly reduce species populations that are only found in one geographic location. They can place significant financial burden on all levels of government that work to manage invasive species, and we can dive into that a little bit as well. But essentially, municipalities end up being the ones that carry the burden of invasive species costs typically, which is a little bit surprising and not something that municipalities need to have on their plate either. But yeah, there are many costs in managing them that usually fall to a local level. And they change species composition and diversity in a landscape, altering how the ecosystems can function. And so this is basically the creation of monocultures. When invasive species kind of take over, they become like the sole species of that area, which reduces biodiversity, which is a really important thing. And biodiversity is something that we need to kind of combat climate change. So obviously a very important issue, like climate crisis. And so combating the climate crisis can also include combating invasive species, as invasive species, can have an impact on biodiversity, as I mentioned, and biodiversity mitigates the effects of climate change. And then in turn, climate change prevents and mitigating climate change prevents invasive species. Often invasive species may be able to survive in, warmer conditions as there become more conditions for them to exist. And so this is something that, we want to try to prevent as well as their spread, so that we can, basically in turn have this cyclical kind of benefit. So invasive species in Ontario, unfortunately, Ontario is the #1 province for invasive species in Canada. And this is somewhat linked to trade, especially in the Great Lakes region. Ballast water was responsible for a lot of introduction of invasive species. And so it's a really, and also population size is a pretty critical factor in invasive species spread in Ontario. And so there are, these figures may be a little bit old at this point, but there are 440 invasive plants in southern Ontario, 39 known potential invasive forest insects, 10 invasive tree diseases, and 180 an invasive species in the Great Lakes. And this is also just known figures. As I mentioned, aquatic realms can be a little bit more obscure in our numbers because we aren't able to see really everything that's there. So yeah, it's a big problem here in Ontario. And so I wanted to also just briefly touch on a couple new detections we had this summer. It was unfortunately the summer of invasives, which kept us on our toes. So we did have a detection of oat wilt, a couple actually. And oat wilt is a tree disease that affects obviously oak trees, and it can actually impact the vascular system of trees, and is responsible for unfortunately killing them within a few weeks. So really quite a big issue, and we actually usually work with CFIA to deal with that kind of thing. So it's being monitored in a couple different locations across the province. So hopefully going to be able to be at the point where it can be controlled. But it was still, a little disheartening to receive that news this year. Another noticed species was called marbled crayfish. And so this is a species of crayfish that actually belongs to the aquaculture and I guess aquarium trade. And so it was likely as a result of an intentional release at some point where somebody released their crayfish into a pond, and they actually can reproduce without a mate. So they are self-cloning, and unfortunately able to spread pretty quickly and end up having an impact on infrastructure and erosion because they burrow into the sides of mud. So marbled crayfish definitely was a big concern this year, first detection in Burlington. So that's ongoing. There was an expansion of hemlock woolly adelgid this year, which is a species of an issue that impacts hemlock trees. So there were a couple more spots located down in the Grimsby area. And there were also a couple detections of grass carp, which are a species of an invasive carp. And they are not actually known to be in the Canadian waters of the Great Lakes yet, but we did have a few captures, including one female that was actually fertile in the Bay of Quinte, which is not a good sign. So it was unfortunately a summer of invasives, but we've had a few different finds this year. So invasive species are a very costly issue. They actually, end up costing municipalities and conservation authorities about $50.8 million a year in Ontario. And so those numbers are broken down there. Each municipality is expected to spend about $218,000 a year, and conservation authorities are $314,000 a year. So a very, heavy burden on conservation authorities and municipalities. Again, they usually end up being the ones who manage them at a local level. So this is, definitely a costly issue here in the province. So there is, in case you're curious to know about the policy side of it, we do have an Invasive Species Act in Ontario. And so this was a new act came into force in 2017. It was actually updated last January in 2022. And so the aim of the act is to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species in Ontario and kind of have regulatory guidelines that will eventually, hopefully lead to the slowing of the spread of species. So there are currently 22 species that are prohibited, as well as 11 species that are restricted. And in 2022, updates to the act were made to address wild pigs. Not so much an issue in Ontario as much as the other provinces in Canada. But definitely something to be aware of, as well as 13 additional species were added. And interestingly, watercraft were regulated as a carrier of invasive species. So we can talk about clean, drain, dry in a few minutes, but essentially, acknowledging that watercraft can be used to carry invasive species. And new amendments have been proposed for January 2024. And what these regulations kind of do is make sure that importation is prohibited, and species can't be spread through sales. Is basically the main premise of the act. We do actually have a couple of federal acts that do cover invasive species, although there's not one singular act that's responsible for that. But there are a few, plant-related and wildlife-related acts, including Species at Risk Act, that do kind of address invasive species issues, as well as aquatic species that are regulated across Canada, including species of carp. So that's a little bit about the legislation. So I'll do a quick overview of what invasive species you may come across in Muskoka, because there are quite a few. And so a non-comprehensive list, but I wanted to just kind of, touch on a few of the common suspects here in Muskoka. So I've divided them, in terms of terrestrial, aquatic, and insects and pathogens. So we'll start with terrestrial species. So a few species you might find include garlic mustard, which is the one right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's got the one that's in the person's hand with the white flowers. So that can be found in different parts of Muskoka. It's a type of terrestrial plant. Purple loosestrife is one of the most notorious invasive species in Canada. It is widespread across, pretty much the whole country at this point. And it's also a type of plant, and unfortunately, it's a very beautiful plant. So I think it often gets confused with an ornamental species that people may want in their gardens, but it does end up being a problem for biodiversity by not providing the same level of resources for a native species. Wild parsnip actually belongs to the carrot family, but it's a pretty significant issue because they are difficult to remove. They end up can be a health concern because they do have different defense mechanisms that can be harmful to humans. Japanese knotweed is another one that is just at the bottom there. It's a little hard to distinguish, but it is very difficult to remove once it's in place. Common buckthorn is the one with the berries there, and as well as periwinkle, which you may recognize as a garden species, but it does end up becoming invasive because it can spread on forest floors. In terms of aquatic species, so my specialty at the Invasive Species Center is more in the aquatic realm. And so a couple of them that are worth noting in Muskoka are Phragmites. We talked a little bit about that. So that's that reed in the middle. Usually you can see it actually along roadways. You may not recognize it as an invasive species, but it is, usually in the center median of the road because it can travel on, its seeds can travel through your tires. Eurasian water milfoil is the one at the bottom in the water. A lot of cottage areas ended up getting this, unfortunately, due to fragmentation and transportation on boats being, I guess it gets disposed kind of in waterways through boating. Round goby is another one more in Lake Simcoe. I've heard a lot of scary things about round goby in that area. Although I don't personally fish, but it is quite a big issue in that area, as well as zebra and quagga mussels. We can talk about those in a few minutes too, and spiny water flea. Again, I've got a couple slides coming up on them. In terms of insects and pathogens, emerald ash borer, big issue in the area as it kind of goes through. Spongy moth, which was formerly known as LDD, and gypsy moth. LLD. Yeah, sorry, I always get those confused. But one of it ends up being impacts the canopies of trees. So you may have also noticed that in the last few years that there have been a few flare-ups of spongy moth. Beech bark disease is another one that impacts beech trees, ends up being quite detrimental to beech tree populations, as well as elm zigzag sawfly, which I came across myself recently, which is kind of surprising. I wasn't too familiar with the species, but in the Lake of Bays area, I saw one on the ground. So they are present in Muskoka as well. So just going to do a little bit of a deep dive into a couple of these species. So zebra and quagga mussels are invasive freshwater mussels that can be found throughout Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba. So zebra mussels, you may know them from the Great Lakes. Along those shorelines, they end up being quite a big issue along the shores and also on infrastructure, boating, equipment, and beyond. So they're native to the Black Sea region of Eurasia and arrived in the Great Lakes via ballast water. So when they were in their veliger stage, which is when they're small enough to, you can barely see them with the naked eye. And since then, they've spread throughout North America. And so to identify them, you can look for the zigzag patterns. They lie flat and they're more triangular shaped. So that's the zebra mussel. It's about 4 centimeters typically. And then in terms of the quagga mussel, also very similar to the zebra mussel, except there are circular dark rings. It doesn't lie flat. It's lighter in coloring, and there's a more rounded shape to them. And sometimes you can see both of the species together, that they look very similar and have similar kind of impacts, which is why we usually group them together. So in terms of their impacts on the environment, they can form dense colonies and clog intake pipes, boat motors, and even other mussels, including other native species of mussels. Their sharp shells, I'm sure if you've come across them, you would know that they're not fun to walk on. They can create kind of hazardous areas on the beach, which impacts obviously recreational ability to kind of recreate in potentially, tourist areas. They consume plankton and reduce availability for other species. So this is a huge impact on other species of mussels, and end up increasing the water quality as well. So the filtering ability allows sunlight to penetrate the water and create more algal blooms. So you may notice that the water looks clear, but this can actually have a pretty significant impact on the temperature, as well as other species that may be existing and relying on darker water. And bioaccumulation of toxins have been linked to avian botulism as well. So yeah, zebra mussels are quite a big one. So in terms of Phragmites, again, this is the plant I was mentioning along the side of the road. So it's an aggressive plant that spreads quickly and outcompetes native species, similar narrative to other invasive species. So there are actually species of native Phragmites. So to kind of differentiate them, you can look at stand height and density. So usually the stands of Phragmites are actually very, very tight and dense, whereas native Phragmites have a bit more of a spread to them. You can tell also by stem color and leaf color, as well as the seed head density, which are usually a bit darker and kind of more thick. So that's one way to kind of tell them apart, or a couple ways to tell them apart. In terms of the impacts, they crowd out native vegetation, resulting in decreased plant biodiversity, provide poor habitat for wildlife. Although some wildlife do use them for habitat, it's still not something that is used by all wildlife, and they can eventually force out species at risk. They grow really quickly. Once you kind of notice a stand, they can actually develop very quickly and end up becoming very dense and widespread. They actually increase fire hazards because stands are composed of a high percentage of dead stalks, and they can affect agriculture, cause road safety hazards, and impact recreational activities such as swimming, boating, and angling, and access to the water, because the stands end up being so dense that you can barely get to the water. And so just to touch too on the road safety aspect of it, they can actually block out your view of the road if they are dense enough. So they can be kind of an issue if you're, in a turning lane or trying to see the road. Basically, they end up being quite impactful for that. Another one I wanted to highlight it's called spiny water flea. So this is a tiny little zooplankton that is originated in Eurasia. So it actually has a single large black eye with a long tail that ends up being 60% of its total body length. It has 1 to 3 barbs on its tail spine, which is used as a defense mechanism. And it's barely visible with the naked eye. You kind of have to know it's there to be able to see it. But they end up being quite impactful as well. So they're different colors too, just in terms of ID. But in terms of their impact, they actually can impact fishing capability because they consume zooplankton. So they are zooplankton. So they end up causing issues for bass, walleye, and yellow perch who consume zooplankton typically. So it reduces their food supply. And they've previously shown kind of 30 to 40% decline in native zooplankton species. And in the US, the damage from spiny water flea has been significant because of fishing, recreational and commercial fishing opportunities. And as you can see kind of on this fishing line here, that's a bunch of spiny water flea that are able to attach to a line. I wanted to touch on this particular species because it has been located in Algonquin Park. And that was a pretty devastating blow to the area because it's a very devastating species. It's very difficult to manage, actually impossible to manage. And so the idea is to just make sure that they aren't spreading to additional lakes within the park. And so this is a significant issue in the area because some lakes in Muskoka may have them, but others don't. So cleaning your equipment is very critical in preventing this species. So another one I wanted to touch on is emerald ash borer. You may be familiar with this one. It's an invasive wood-boring beetle native to parts of Asia. It's a little green beetle. And so ash trees, are obviously very important because they they can benefit the environment through windbreaks, temperature regulation, pollution abatement, runoff prevention, and provision of wildlife habitat. And so, this is a photo you can see here in Kilbear Provincial Park, which I used to work at Kilbear and was part of the removal process. And it was really devastating to see the impacts of emerald ash borer there. Thousands of trees were removed because this is unfortunately, one of the only ways to manage them, especially at this scale. So it's already done extensive damage kind of across North America, killing millions of ash trees in Ontario, Quebec, and many US states. And so obviously being concerned about your firewood and removing of other wood materials is critical in preventing its spread to further parts of the country. So a couple species I wanted to also just touch on that could be a threat to Muskoka and beyond in the province. So I wanted to touch on what's called water soldier. So this is an invasive aquatic plant that's native to Europe and Northwest Asia, not yet present in Muskoka that we're aware of. So there are populations, though, that occur in Ontario within the Trent Severn Waterway and in Red Horse Lake, north of Gananoque. And so this is actually a prohibited species now in the Invasive Species Act. But prior to that, it was sold as an ornamental species. So it's likely that it was introduced by an individual in a couple different areas, or it escaped kind of a water garden setting. So it belongs to a pathway that we call the organisms in trade. And so this is basically as a result of it being sold in stores in retail settings. And so for identification of water soldier, it actually looks kind of like a pineapple, the top of a floating pineapple, with sword-shaped leaves that are bright green, little flowers, as well as plants that it produces kind of offsets, so similar to kind of a spider plant that you may have at home. And so this is, if you do see something like this, obviously a pretty key concern. So there are the impacts of water soldiers, that it creates dense mats that kind of spread across an entire water system, crowding out native vegetation, altering the water chemistry because it prevents sunlight. And it can actually impact recreational activities like swimming and boating because people may not be able to actually swim through or boat through these areas once there is an infestation. And they're very sharp plants as well. So it's very kind of dangerous to be handling them as well as swimming through them. And they're actually spread through this fragmentation as well. So if you do handle them and break them apart, they can continue to spread. So one to keep an eye out for. And if you do see it, I'm going to also quickly show how you can report it. So another one that I wanted to touch on is species of invasive carp. So there are 4 species of carp that aren't yet established in Canada. They're not here. Often confused with the common carp, which is actually already here in Canada. But we are mostly concerned out of these 4 species of the grass carp. And the grass carp can eat up to 40% of their body weight in a single day. So quite a huge impact on aquatic vegetation, availability for other species. And also because of their high intake, there's a pretty high output as well. And so this impacts water quality in especially, smaller settings. They're usually actually like to be in more wetlands. And they push out native species that kind of depend on these wetlands. So the concern is the Great Lakes region. As I mentioned, there were a couple grass carp that were captured this year. So there is a concern that they may be coming up. They've actually are already established on the American side of Lake Erie. So unfortunately, kind of in the same area, and definitely one that we want to keep an eye out for. As I mentioned, all 4 species of carp are kind of, they're very hungry fish. They grow very large very quickly. And so they actually can become so big that they can't be predated. And they also outcompete native species for food because they eat so much. So huge economic impacts that can occur if they do establish here in Canada. And also in terms of the silver carp, another species of invasive carp, they actually jump usually 3 feet out of the water when they're startled by boats. So you may have seen those videos online of the fish jumping, and that's a silver carp. And so another one we're trying to ensure it doesn't come up to Canada. Health risk with them jumping out, while people are boating for recreational purposes, they can actually cause quite a bit of damage. They're big fish, so not a fun one. In terms of identifying the species of carp, if you are angling, in the Great Lakes, this is a good reference to have, and we do have them available online. So I won't go through kind of all the details of this, but there are kind of some particular features that you can look for, especially in terms of the grass carp. They are often confused with the common carp, but some ways to differentiate them are actually the mouth. So there's no barbels on the mouth of a grass carp, and it actually has just a regular mouth, not a sucker, which you can see on the common carp, as well as you can tell from their short dorsal fin at the top. So those are some things to look for to differentiate them. And another species that they often get confused with is a fall fish. And again, definitely worth looking at, like the mouth areas is one of the key areas to look, as well as for the fall fish, the location of the eye. So again, these are also available online if you require a reference. So if you do capture a carp in the Great Lakes, or if you happen to find one further north, we do have ID guides, so worth consulting those before determining whether or not you have one. And if you're positive, you can take a photo and report it to Fisheries and Oceans Canada. They ask that you don't release it, and they do want to keep the specimen so they can do some analyzing and monitoring of the species. And so there's a couple pathways to do that, again, listed online if you do find. So in terms of pathways of invasive species, okay, so they're here, what do we do kind of thing? So there are a few things we can do to prevent them from going any further. And so this is being mindful of those pathways of how they can be spread and how they did arrive initially. So a couple aquatic pathways include live bait, boating, ballast water, and pet release. So live bait, often species can be confused with native species and end up being released into water bodies and then becoming invasive. So being mindful of your bait, not letting it loose. And it's actually illegal now. So I can talk about that in a few minutes. But yeah, you have to be very mindful of your bait, where you're getting it and where you're dumping it. Boating, boater pathway, can dive into that in a few minutes, as well as ballast water. It's kind of where small species can actually be in the intake of boats, and there are new regulations that kind of try to manage this. So fortunately, that pathway is mitigated at a federal level. And then pet release is another one That's usually where I actually work, is trying to encourage people not to let loose their species like goldfish, which are actually also an invasive species once they're released into the wild. In terms of terrestrial pathways, we have firewood, equipment, horticulture, and trade. I dive into a couple of these in a minute. So just in terms of trade, this is again more of a regulated pathway at the provincial and federal levels, but essentially making sure that live species are controlled and not carrying invasive species on them. So live bait, as I mentioned, making sure that you aren't dumping your bait within 30 meters of a water body. That's actually regulated by law at this point. So the province actually has management sectors for bait, that live or dead bait fish can't be transferred between water bodies. And so this is critical in reducing the spread of invasives. In terms of boating, again, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the Invasive Species Act section, it's actually a regulated pathway at this point. So it is required that you clean, drain, and dry your boat before transporting it over land or to another water body. So this, requires folks to be looking. Here's our boat diagram in case you needed to see it. And then our requirements are that you clean your boat and all related equipment before leaving the water body. So making sure you're removing all visible debris that you may have picked up was kind of key in this step. And then giving it a quick wipe down and making sure that the body of the boat and all the associated equipment are clean, including the trailer. And then draining your boat in terms of making sure you're pulling the plugs and all live well containers are empty, and any other part of the boat that may have water in it. So that's step 2, clean, drain. And then in terms of dry, you can dry it or disinfect your vessel by making sure that it's at least sitting out in the sunlight for at least 5 days, or you can wash it with hot water or pressurized water at 2,500 psi is the recommended kind of level. So those are kind of the steps to make sure that your boat's clean, because there are species, as I mentioned, spiny water flea, zebra mussels that can be so tiny you may not be able to see them, but it's imperative that you're cleaning your boat to remove them in case they're there. And on that note, too, a quick anecdote. I was in Algonquin recently for a work project, and we actually came across at the boat launch in Opeongo somebody had actually drained their live well, and a bunch of zebra mussels had fallen out onto the pavement there, which would have been a very significant issue in Algonquin, because as far as we know, there are no zebra mussels that are in that area, and it would have been a really devastating hit to find them. So fortunately, they were dumped before the boat went in. But yeah, it was a pretty scary thing. In terms of another pathway here, firewood also, as I mentioned, should be sourced locally and not carried to different parts of the province, because even though it may seem like the province does have a certain species in one area, it may not be in another. So making sure that you aren't moving firewood between locations. Emerald ash borer is the prime example of this, of how it can be carried on wood and its decimated local forests. Including another pathway could include equipment. And so actually when you're out hiking and everything, you want to make sure that you're cleaning your boots between hiking trails to make sure that you're not carrying seeds or any other organisms on your boots that could be brought to different areas where they may not exist. And this actually includes your pets as well. They can be carriers of seeds and other small debris. Another highlight is horticulture. So if you have garden species that may be invasive, making sure that you're not disposing them, further in the backyard or, somewhere where there may be a waterway that they can get into. This is a pathway for a species such as water soldier that I had spoken to a little bit earlier. And so want to make sure that they're disposed of properly. And so just to now, if you do come across an invasive species, especially one of the ones that are, of higher concern, we do ask that people report them. So this is how you can be kind of at the leading edge of invasive species awareness and management. So the importance of early detection and reporting, there are a number of reasons, but one of the primary ones that we like to discuss is that prevention is actually the most cost-effective form of management. So controlling invasive species before they become established will reduce kind of their impact on human health, biodiversity, the economy, and society. And so as soon as a species arrives, like that eradication phase is really critical, or preventing them from even getting there is even better, because once they're there, they become more and more expensive to control as they sort of spread. And so there are different ways to report invasive species across Canada. So reporting a sighting, you can do that on our website. We have a report a sighting page, and we actually work with EDMAPS, which is a rapid response kind of program, the early detection program that ends up mapping out invasive species. So this is the program here. It's led by the University of Georgia, and basically provides like distribution maps of invasive species across Canada and the US, and it provides profiles and information on these species. And the ISC has actually coordinated the National EDMAPS Working Group to increase accessibility of EDMAPS across Canada, which has been pretty great in making sure that more citizen scientists are involved in awareness and distribution of species. So the benefits of reporting, I guess I'll go into to what happens when you do report. So if you observe a species and you enter it into EDMAPS, what happens is the data is loaded onto the website. It's confirmed whether or not it's invasive by data reviewers and verifiers. So people who are trained to be able to find the identifying features on a species. So then if it's confirmed, the data becomes freely available for people to use. So you can go onto the website and see the distribution maps as a member of the public. And you can kind of go through and see the distribution of the species as they are reported across Canada. So reporting is very important. The timelines for verification occurs through priorities of species. So there are a few different species that are identified as priority. And so when you report those ones, they move up to the top of the queue. And so high-risk species that are not currently known in Ontario are pretty key here, as well as high-risk species that are established but may be reported outside of their range of distribution. So as I mentioned, water soldier exists in a few parts of Ontario, but not in other parts of Ontario. So they may may bump those ones up a little bit. So reporting also helps with, the reporting process does involve a number of questions that are relative to, species infestation, the habitat abundance, which just gives a better idea of the folks who are doing the reporting to be able to see what that basically entails, like what the species and the issue kind of entails. So a couple notes there. And verified reports are again added to public database, and so anybody can see where they are. So reporting is really important, and I know I'm going into a lot of detail here, but it's because it's a very important process in invasive species monitoring, which is still kind of something that we're looking to work on across the province and beyond. So the distribution maps kind of give us our best understanding of invasive species. There were more reports, the more accurate, obviously, that the distribution maps are. So we use this kind of information to select sites for management and outreach, increase local knowledge, identify new infestations and leading edges, because those are very rapidly changing. And we can understand the movement of invasive species over time, potentially influence policy and enact kind of response plans for species. So really critical that reports are coming in. So a couple different examples. So this is purple loosestrife distribution at a kind of macro level in the Sault Ste. Marie area. But as we become, as more reports are submitted, they become more, detailed, and we're able to tell where everything is. Garlic mustard, same thing, a bit more of a macro view, but you can kind of as you get closer, this is an instance of common buckthorn, we're able to tell exactly where those species are, and management plans can be put in place once those, hotspots are kind of identified. So that's pretty critical. I won't get into too much into management today because it is quite a bit of a feat to be managing invasive species, but I will point you to best management practices. So a couple of the big ones that people try to manage include Phragmites and garlic mustard, and so that we do have best management practices available online, and that management can kind of there's a video as well, can kind of help you guide how you may best look at removing something that is in those environmental conditions, because it changes for each kind of environment where the species is established. Interestingly, Amanda is very familiar with the removal of invasive Phragmites, which is something that is always a frequently asked question. But yeah, we do have a best management practice guide for that as well. And we do also have identification guides and fact sheets. So I would encourage you to look at those in order to kind of properly identify different species based on their characteristics, all available online as well. In terms of, there are more databases, again, as I mentioned, best management practice database online, as well as risk assessments and pathway assessments. So if you're really feeling like diving into the depths of invasive species, those are really valuable resources. In terms of our work with the Invasive Species Center for Management of Invasive Species, we do actually have an Invasive Species Action Fund that we have implemented over the last few years. And this year we did have actually 3 different streams of grants available to different community groups and Indigenous communities, conservation groups, and non-for-profits, where we had micro grants, accelerated impact grants, and transformative action grants that were distributed to different groups across the province to support kind of invasive species management. And this has been a successful program so far. We've mobilized 151 groups, more than 1,400 volunteers and staff had helped the work on the ground. 61 Indigenous groups and communities, as well as 72 municipalities were supported. So a lot of people who are involved in this, in the help and management on the ground of invasive species. So something to look out for too, if you are working for a community group or organization and want to look at kind of managing the spread of invasive species, this is definitely something to look into if you have capacity. And I think that may be the end. It is. So right on time, it looks like. So apologies, I didn't leave much time here, but and I'm open to any questions too, if anybody has anything.
That was amazing, Jenna. Thank you so much. It was so great to learn not just about the invasive species themselves, but all of the resources that you guys have available, and the options for reporting, which I'll definitely be sharing when I get emails about, from community members about invasive species. So definitely lots of great information in there. I do think we've got one chat, so I'll open that up and see. So Patricia asked, is there any difference between the way reports of invasive species are handled on private land or public land?
That's a great question. And I guess I wouldn't know so much about the handling of it. It would depend on the priority level of that species. So as I mentioned, there are a few different criteria that are sought out. And so if it is a priority species, the report itself would probably be accelerated. Although I don't think that the actual location of private or public land would make much of a difference, but the management of that species would be different based on whether or not it was private or public land. It's a lot easier to manage invasive species on public land when there are programs in place and people who are typically responsible for that. Private land can be a bit tricky because it is dependent on what the owner would like to see happen. So in terms of the actual report itself, though, I think it would just depend on the species. I hope that helps.
Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions for Jenna? I know she had her information on the last slide, which was really great. So if you have any questions, you could always contact her that way. Carol Ann has asked what the website is for the EDD Ed Maps.
Yeah, so if you Google EdMaps, it'll come up. It is edmaps.org. So just as it seems.
Okay.
Yeah,
Edmaps.org. Fantastic.
really interesting resources on there. That's where I sourced a lot of my information in terms of like the distribution of species in Muskoka too. So it's
Mhm.
helpful to see.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm.
I should definitely report all the species I'm seeing on
Yeah,
there as well.
definitely.
I actually had a question as well. So I was
Yeah, sure.
wondering, because you were talking a bit about the emerald ash borer management at Killbear, and
Yeah.
so I haven't looked too much into how best to manage EAB. Um, but is it the case that if you do have it detected, you should be cutting down those trees to prevent further spread? Or is it okay and safe to leave them when once they've been affected and just say they're gonna die anyway? What is the
Mm,
best thing to do?
I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of, yeah, unfortunately, like kind of once it's there, it's there.
Yeah.
But that said, I mean, Killbear, the difference between kind of the recreational setting and, maybe a private setting is that, the trees become a hazard for falling once they're impacted by EAB. And so a lot of the driver behind the management there was public safety.
Gotcha.
Um, that said, like in terms of reducing the spread of EAB, I don't know if removal of the trees is really as effective if they're already there.
Mhm.
That said, like it does slow the spread, so it is a matter of resources and
Yeah,
access to to
gotcha.
that kind of thing. Yeah,
Makes
yeah,
sense. Thank you.
yeah.
Awesome.
And
I don't see any other questions. Lots
yeah,
of thank yous coming in now.
yeah.
So if you have
Thanks.
anything else, let us know. But thank you so much, Jenna, for joining us today. It was awesome.
Thanks so much for having me. I really had a great time. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.